Welcome to Ministry Convos. This is Eric, and today I'm going to give some teaching and preaching tips on Old Testament narratives. Recently, I was invited to preach a chapel services at a local Christian school not far from here. There was an elementary that I got to preach to, and then later there was a middle school and high school combined chapel. Well, for the elementary, I figured I would preach something, definitely a narrative, definitely a story, but maybe someone they haven't really heard too much before. So I chose the narrative of Genesis 26, of Isaac redigging the wells. That was just, I don't know why, it's just been one of my favorite stories lately. So that's what I preached to them, and the pastor of the church got up afterwards, and he looked over to me and said, "Thank you for picking a text that we don't hear all the time." And he asked everyone in the audience, now all the kiddos were there, as well as the Christian school teachers were there. He said, "How many of you, it's your first time to ever hear that story preached?" I think all of the kids raised their hand. And to my shock, almost all of the adults raised their hand also. Now, these are Christian school teachers that have been basically in church their whole lives, probably, most of them, no doubt, and in chapel. That leads me to the question, why don't people hear more Old Testament narratives being preached? It's interesting. It's a very fascinating thought because Mathewson brings it out in The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narratives, how people are naturally more attracted to Paul's letters, New Testament epistles, and how we kind of delegate the narratives to the kids. Well, it's fascinating to me. When I was at Southwestern, did some D-Min work there. I had Dr. Matthew McKellar teaching the class, preaching the Old Testament, and that class changed me. It's forever changed me. I've said it many times and I'll say it again. That one class was worth the tuition for the entire program. My eyes were opened to teaching and preaching Old Testament narratives. So I thought I'd record some stuff and just try to share with you guys, any listeners out there, some stuff that has helped me. I sure hope it's a help to you. So we have to start off with asking the question, why is preaching the Old Testament difficult? It is. It's not as easy as teaching or preaching the New Testament because it's not as clear cut. The New Testament, particularly Paul's letters, are mainly didactic. What that means is they're intended to instruct. You know, the letter of 1 Corinthians, for example, it's on how to put a broken church back together. The church was a mess. I'm writing you this letter of firm correction. Here's what you need to do to get things back on track. Galatians, how to fight off the false teaching of Judaizers. 1 Timothy, how to reach and raise up disciples in Ephesus and organize churches there, right? The themes of Paul's letters are very clear right away. They're didactic in nature. They are intended to instruct. What about Genesis? What about Isaiah? What about Jonah? What's the intention of those books? They're different. They're not didactic. They're not necessarily intended to instruct directly in the same way that letters are. They are not epistles. They are narratives. So what do we do with these? A narrative, first we need to understand that a narrative is a story. A narrative is a story. It's a series of events which are connected. And it's more work than reading Paul's letters or teaching Paul's letters or preaching Paul's letters because we have to put the pieces together. We need to figure out what is the purpose, what is the lesson here. Once again, Paul's letters is very easy, abstain from idols. We already know what the commandment is. But when we look at the Old Testament, we're faced with these narratives. Sometimes we can scratch our heads and try to figure out, man, what's the purpose of this, right? What's the purpose of this story? What do I preach from this story? So I'm going to give you a couple tips today. Tip number 1, identify the characters. When you read an Old Testament story, identify the characters. You're typically going to have 3 categories of people mentioned. You're going to have a protagonist, that's a good guy. You're going to have an antagonist, that's a bad guy or an adversary, right? The enemy or the bad guy, the Canaanites, for example, or whatever. And then you're also going to have a third category, and that is what's called a foil. A foil is a secondary character that's not the protagonist. and it's not the antagonist, but its purpose is to heighten the main character by providing a contrast. All right, so let's take an example. Now, this is a New Testament narrative. We'll give one New Testament, a couple Old Testament examples of these. The story of the prodigal son. The protagonist is the father. The antagonist is the son who stayed. And the foil is actually the prodigal son. So that even though it's known as the story of the prodigal son's really not the main character. In fact, in Luke 15, directly before that, it reads this, Luke 15, 1 and 2, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" Well, right after that, Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son. And the prodigal son is not about the prodigal son. The prodigal son, the guy who goes and spends all his living and then is welcomed back into the Father's house, those are the tax collectors and sinners that were drawing near Jesus. And the older son, the son who stayed, who was bitter at the end, is the bad guy. He's the antagonist. That's actually the main character in that, because Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and saying, you are just like that older son who's bitter that these tax collectors and sinners and people who are far from me are now coming close, and you're jealous of their forgiveness and intimacy with me. So we have to understand and then get the roles of the characters right. If we confuse the roles of the characters, it leads to a mishandling of God's word. An Old Testament narrative is Job 2. Job in chapter 2, his wife sees everything that's happening to him. She says, "Curse God and die." Whoa, hang on, Mrs. Job. She's a foil. That's what her character is, a clear contrast to Job's. And Job's saying, I'm not going to do that. Why even have her in there? She is in there to heighten Job's character, to provide a contrast. Job is like, man, he's having a rough day. He's having a rough time, but he's handling it pretty good. And then you read his wife's response, "Curse God and die." And then he won't. Now you're like, man, now Job is really a stellar person in character. She heightens his character. That's a foil. Another example would be Jonah. Jonah's obviously the main character, really. He's the antagonist. God is the protagonist. But you're also going to see some mariners when they're on the boat. They were foils. In fact, when Jonah tells them who he is and the God he serves, they were all like, whoa, what did you do? They were actually calling him to repentance. And they actually had a softer heart toward repentance, and it showed how stubborn Jonah was. Because Jonah was like, you're going to have to throw me overboard. And even then, only after 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, then he repented. Man, those mariners are making Jonah look really stubborn. Well, that's their purpose. They're foils in there. So we have to understand, when you don't just automatically think of the characters and think of like, oh, what's a character sketch here? No. Try to classify the characters. Are they a protagonist? Are they the good guy? Are they an antagonist? Are they the bad guy? Or are they a foil? Are they neither one, but do they heighten the character or bring out good or bring out bad in others? All right, so identify the characters. Now, once you identify the characters, that leads us to tip number 2. Focus on the plot of the story. Yes, consider the characters, but don't stop there. Too often, when we come to Old Testament narratives, we look at the characters and discover the characters, and we figured, okay, Jonah did this. It's about Jonah. The book's called Jonah. Therefore, we're going to preach on Jonah. Hang on a second. Consider the characters, but follow the plot. In Old Testament narratives, the plot is always greater than the characters. Now that right there is remember that. The plot is always greater than the characters. You see, the plot of the story shows God's hand in the story. And that is where the power of narratives really come to life. If you stop short of focusing on the plot, you're just going to end up, doing really a character sketch, which can come out kind of shallow at times. So what we want to do is focus in on the plot, which leads to the question, what do you look for in the plot? There's almost always a crisis and almost always a resolution somewhere in the story. In every narrative, there's a drama, a confrontation, there's some suspense, there is some friction, there's action, there's contrast, there's something. That story, that narrative is about some event. Maybe it's an event in somebody's lives. Maybe there's a personality conflict. There's something in there. And you need to find what that something is. So narratives always tell you something about God. Don't read narratives the same way you'd read New Testament epistles or letters or even Psalms or Proverbs. They're different literary genres. You have to treat them differently. Don't get hung up with the immediate commands. Too often we'll get used to preaching or reading through Paul's letters, and then we'll go to, Ezekiel or something, and we'll see somebody says a command and we'll want to read it the same way or teach it the same way. And we really want to be careful about that. Narratives are all about storytelling. Storytelling is very important, and we want to be sensitive to the story of the text. Don't get hung up with the immediate commands. Narratives are super powerful because they always tell you something about God. The difference between narratives, particularly Old Testament narratives, and the New Testament primarily is the element of time. Narratives have an element of time, and they show how God deals with man over time. If you focus on the characters, you're going to fall into the trap of the heroic hermeneutic. You're going to ask yourself subjective questions like, what would David do? Well, which David? The David that defeated Goliath or the guy that slept with Bathsheba? What about Moses? The Moses who's a murderer? The Moses who tried to make excuses as to why he couldn't serve God? The Moses who broke the tablets or the Ten Commandments of the Ten Commandments out of anger that God wrote, right? So we don't, yes, focus on the characters, but look past the characters, look past the people into God's working over time. That is what narratives are all about. And most narratives are plot dominated. They're not character dominated. They're dominated by the plot. When you embrace the plot, you see how God works over time. And that's what narratives are all about. Narratives have a lot of wisdom and life lessons because of that. There's a lot of life lessons because you see how God interacts with man over time. And that's also what makes narratives so timeless, is God still interacts with man in the same ways, in the very same ways, the same things that, Jacob and Job dealt with. We deal with the same things, and God deals with us the same way. So there's a big connection there, but you're not going to see that if you're just focused on the characters. So look past the characters to the plot. All right. Now, there's a couple of warnings here. A big mistake is focusing on the character, not the plot. We already talked about that. The next one is stay away from the summary approach. That's the second warning here. The summary approach would be, say, outlining an airtime. Have you ever heard an Old Testament outline like this? Abraham's test, Abraham's obedience, Abraham's reward. I mean, bore me to death. Great. You summarized it, but what does that mean? I just got to be honest. No one in your congregation is going to come up to you afterwards and be like, oh, that outline was just so. Nobody cares about the outline. In narratives, don't get stuck into an outline that you're just used to preaching from an outline. So you project that into the narrative. No. Let the story itself speak. Don't cram it into a can of an outline. All right. In Old Testament narratives, it's better to focus on the plot scene by scene. That's how you do it. Instead of, going through your faithful 3-point outline, alliterated outline, or however you do it, focus scene by scene. Dr. McKellar taught me this, and I have since fallen in love with narratives. When preaching or teaching narratives, going scene by scene is expository. I have an example here for you. Genesis chapter 33 records Jacob and Esau, and for the first time in many years, they're seeing each other since Jacob betrayed Esau. Now, if you remember when they first met, they are not when they first met, they're brothers, right? But when they had to separate, it's because Esau said, I'm going to kill Jacob. He was running for his life. He had to run to his uncle Laban. Well, it wasn't until years later after he left that crooked scoundrel Uncle Laban, guess what? Who was coming? Esau was coming. Struck fear into Jacob's bones. He didn't know what he was doing. And then ultimately he had to wrestle with God. When during the wrestling match, his hip was dislocated and he walked with a limp. Why would God give him a limp? God gave Jacob a limp to make sure that he could not get away from Esau. So he had this confrontation with Esau here. And in Genesis 33 records it. Here was the outline that I chose for it, that I used. It was, the first scene. Jacob sees Esau coming with 400 men and quickly conceives a plan. Otherwise, can you picture that? Finally, Jacob, he's already walking with a limp. He's already wrestled with God. He's already confessed. And then, dun-na-na, here comes Esau. Uh-oh, he can't get away. He quickly conceives a plan. He sends him gifts, things like that. That's verses 1 through 3 of Genesis 33. Then you go on to scene 2, verses 4 through 15. Esau shows he has forgiven Jacob by embracing him. And you know what? God was at work in Jacob's life. God was at work in Esau's life. They fell on each other's neck. They embraced each other. And then the final scene, verses 16 through 20, scene 3, Jacob and Esau depart in peace. Jacob returns to Canaan and erects an altar. For the first time, he erects an altar. Now, when I'm going through it in the sermon, I would, really explore those 3 scenes, walk everybody through the beauty of the text. But at the same time, you have to take all of that and you have to really think about it and put it all together. What is God trying to teach us? What did God do over time? This narrative you can't treat on its own. You have to look back all the way to the beginning of when we're introduced to Jacob. Like I said at the beginning there, where they had to run from each other. Jacob ran from his life. So this was a big conflict. You have to ask yourself, how is God still working out the plot today? Well, there's one thing that we can notice there is, throughout Jacob's life, his relationships changed a lot. His relationship with his family changed. One day he decided to lie to his dad. Next thing you know, he double-crossed his brother also, and then he had to leave and go to his uncle's. He had some friction there too. His uncle was crooked. God separated him and his uncle. Next thing you know, he's back at Esau, and they thought it was going to be a big conflict, but God did a great work, mended them together. They have forgiveness, and you know what? Relationships change over time. There's a big truth that can really connect people there. There's a good timeless truth from that. How does God still working this out today? It's that relationships change. When we went to high school, we had a group of friends. And then if you went to college, or if you didn't go to college, your friends did, and you had to find some new friends. And then, there's the verse in Genesis, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. There's relationship change right there. And then kids, and then coworkers, and then you have church family, and you have all of these things. And in life, you're going to have a lot of different relationships. But here was the thesis that I used from it. It was, God designed your human relationships to change, so you will focus on Him who never changes. You see, you have to take that narrative and think about, what is God doing in the text? It's not a character sketch on Jacob. It's not a character sketch on Esau. What it is it's seeing how God deals with people over time. And that same truth is the same for us. Our human relationships change, but you know what doesn't change? God never changes. If God designed life stages, and we're seeing the life stages of Jacob play out here, He designed life stages so we will stick close to Him no matter what. So obviously we can apply that, follow the direction of God in your relationships. Have you ever tried forcing a relationship? That life is full of that. That's life right there. Follow the direction of God in your relationships, and then keep a strong relationship with God is an obvious application for that, because God designed your human relationships to change, so you'll focus on your relationship with Him who never changes. God doesn't change. In the ups and downs of life, He's always there for you. And finally, Jacob learned that lesson, but God had to injure him in order to do it. But he ultimately he learned that lesson, and it was a glorious thing there. So narratives can be a whole lot of fun, and narratives will connect with your entire congregation. They will connect. They will, the Old Testament will come alive because that same God that is working through the narratives in the Old Testament is working in the local church today. So the characters are gone, but the plot, people can still identify with the plot because God does the same thing. So the first tip is identify the characters, and then the second tip was look through the characters and focus on the plot. Look for God's activity. All right. Now, the tip number 3, craft 2 statements. There's 2 statements that need to be crafted. There's first an exegetical statement. That's what summarizes the plot, summarizes the story, the narrative. And then there's a homiletical statement. Sometimes you'll hear it called the big idea. Haddon Robinson calls it the big idea. Was it Jerry Vines and Jim Shaddix? They talk about the central idea of the text, right? Academic word is thesis. You'll hear some preachers say the theme of the passage, things like that. It's really all talking about, the same thing there. But I like to call it the thesis, or sometimes I'll call it the homiletical statement. Now, what's the difference between the two? An exegetical statement should be a summary of the truth of the passage. For example, I just got done talking about Genesis 33, so let's just continue with that example here. An exegetical statement would just be a summary of the whole story in one sentence. It'd be something along the lines of, God taught Jacob to depend on him through life's relational changes. That's true. That's what the story's about. That is determined by the exegesis of the text, by the passage of that narrative, one single sentence sermon summary, the SSSS, single sentence sermon summary. Some people call it that too. I've called it that before. That is the exegetical statement. Now, the homiletical statement is different. Now, this is a big disconnect because some people think that when they summarize the passage, they've preached. You have not preached until you have applied it, okay? So the homiletical statement includes what's true. It's similar to that exegetical statement. In fact, it's going to sound very similar, but it also includes a to-do. It starts to bridge the gap to application now, all right? And this is always in first person, down to earth. So the exegetical statement would be something like, God taught Jacob to depend on him through life's relational changes, where the homiletical statement, I've already said it, God designed your human relationships to change, so you'll focus on him who never changes. You see how that starts to really drive application. That's the homiletical statement. Application is what turns teaching into preaching. The homiletical statement should be the application of that truth today. The exegetical statement states the truth from the passage. The homiletical statement puts it in terms that we can understand today. The homiletical statement answers the questions of, so what? Why should I care? Well, what does this mean for us today? Oftentimes when preaching the Old Testament, people will feel so distant, and there's like a big disconnect between the text and the people in the pew. And it's because that often it's because there's no bridge to today. It's always that was then, and you have that was then, this is now problem. That every time you open the Bible, preachers are faced with this daunting challenge to bridge that gap and to show people that the Bible is relevant and that will help you. Old Testament narratives are particularly difficult in this, but that's why it's so important, why an exegetical statement alone is not enough. You need to have a homiletical statement. It needs to be in first person. It needs to be on down to earth in the same terms that you would talk to somebody in today. People should know, so what? Why should I care? Oh, you should care because God designed your human relationships to change. So you need to focus on him because he's always there for you no matter what. Wow. That is entirely different. That's entirely different than the exegetical statement. Although it builds off of the exegetical statement, it's rooted in that exegesis, in the plot of the story. and it starts to really bridge the gap to application. So the statement that summarizes the narratives, and then the statement that connects the truth of the narrative to us today. So one other example of this is in Genesis chapter 40. I like to call this one God works during dark times. Genesis chapter 40 is the passage where Joseph is in the prison, and it's really the darkest time of his life. Yes, he was in the pit for a while when his brothers threw him in the pit and talked about killing him, but he wasn't in the pit for very long. In fact, after that, he got sold into slavery. Potiphar bought him, and he was in Potiphar's house. He ended up was falsely accused there, went into the prison, and he was in the dungeon in that prison for a long time. That was a really dark time. And scene 1, chapter 41 through 4, Pharaoh's butler and baker get thrown into prison where Joseph oversees them. Scene 2, verses 5 through 19. Joseph demonstrates faith in God by interpreting the dreams of the butler and baker. And then the final scene through verse 23, the butler was restored to his position and forgot about Joseph for 2 years. Now think about that. For 2 years, Joseph was forgotten about. What would be an exegetical statement for this? Well, the exegetical statement would be something along the lines of, when Joseph was in prison, God remembered him and brought him out at the right time. That's a good summary of the story. That's a solid summary, right? I mean, it can't include every detail. You're just looking for a summary. But don't think you've preached if that's all you say. You also have to bridge the gap to say something like this. Because God always remembers you. You can have confidence in him during dark times. Joseph probably thought, God, where are you? Have you ever been there in life? God is waiting for the right timing to do something in your life, to prove himself strong in your life. But that does not mean that you will not have dark times. He's there. So because God always remembers you, you can have confidence in him during dark times. That's my homiletical statement for that one. There's a difference. They're similar. They always sound alike, and because it's rooted in the exegesis. Okay, so those are 3 tips. I hope they're helpful for you. We are going to look at several other tips, particularly tips this next episode on how to bridge that was then and this is now, and keep people engaged while you're taking them through the passage. So we'll see you next time on Ministry Compass.